In the spring of 1876, in a small room in the German town of Offenbach, a man stood surrounded by stacks of freshly printed books. He was 34 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade writing the manuscript these books contained, working through illness and poverty, and the kind of isolation that slowly erodes the edges of a person until they are no longer quite sure where they end and the silence begins. The book smelled of ink and paper, and something else too, something he alone could recognise. The scent of a life's work finally made solid, finally given form, finally finished in every sense of the word. He lifted one of the volumes and held it in his hands. The title, embossed on the spine, read, Die Philosophie der Erlösung, the philosophy of redemption. Inside those pages was everything he had ever thought, everything he had ever suffered, everything he had ever understood about the nature of existence and why it hurt to be alive. He had poured himself into that manuscript the way water pours into a vessel, completely and without remainder, until there was nothing left of him that the book did not contain. And then, on that spring day, with the smell of fresh ink still in the air, and the stacks of his life's work rising around him like silent witnesses, Philipp Mainländer climbed onto those very books, made a pile high enough to stand upon, secured a rope to a beam above, and hanged himself. He had waited, you see. He had waited specifically for the books to arrive. He could have ended his life at any point during the long years of writing, during the months of poverty when he could barely afford food, during the periods of despair when the words would not come, and his body failed him, and he lay in bed for weeks at a time. But he did not. He waited until the work was finished. He waited until the philosophy was complete. And then, having given his ideas to the world, he stepped off the platform of his own creation and into the silence he had spent so many pages describing. This is not a story about madness, though it would be comfortable to think so. It would be easier to file this man away in the category of those who are simply unwell, whose actions reflect nothing more than the fever of a broken mind. But the uncomfortable truth about Philipp Mainländer is that he was lucid. He was methodical. He knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it, and he left behind hundreds of pages explaining his reasoning in careful, systematic prose. He was not deranged. He was consistent, and that consistency is what makes his story so difficult to look away from. In the years that followed his death, something strange began to happen. His books, which had been printed in a small run and might easily have disappeared into the vast silence that swallows most philosophical works, began to find readers. And some of those readers, after finishing The Philosophy of Redemption, reportedly made the same choice Mainländer had made. They read his careful arguments about why existence was suffering, why the will to live was a kind of curse, and why death was not an ending but a liberation. And then they set the book down and followed him. How many exactly we cannot say with certainty. The historical record is fragmentary, pieced together from letters and newspaper reports, and the kind of whispered stories that gather around any figure who touches the nerve of taboo. Some accounts speak of dozens. Others suggest the number was exaggerated by those who wanted to discredit his philosophy, or by those who wanted to elevate him to the status of a dark prophet. What we know for certain is that his work was linked, in the public imagination of his time, with a kind of contagion, as if the book itself carried something dangerous, something that could pass from page to mind to hand to rope. This is the story of Philipp Mainländer, the philosopher who believed that God had died so that the universe could exist, that existence itself was the slow, painful process of that death, spreading through all matter and all life, and that the highest human achievement was to consciously refuse to continue. It is a story about ideas so extreme that they seem almost impossible to take seriously, until you understand the life that produced them, the century that shaped them, and the strange, terrible logic that holds them together. It is a story about suffering and meaning, and what happens when a brilliant mind follows a single thought all the way to its end. Why would someone do this? What kind of philosophy leads not just to abstract conclusions, but to the conclusion of the philosopher himself? And why, even now, more than a century later, does his name still carry the faint charge of the forbidden? A thinker whose work is read with a kind of nervous fascination, as if the pages themselves might be dangerous. To understand any of it, we have to go back, slowly, carefully, to a world that was already beginning to lose faith in itself, to a time when the old certainties were crumbling and new, stranger questions were rising to take their place. We have to understand who this man was before he became a symbol, what he lived through before he chose to stop living, and what he believed with such absolute conviction that he staked his life on it. So settle in. This is not a simple story, and it does not move quickly. But we have all the time we need. The Germany of Philipp Mainländer's birth was not yet Germany at all. In 1841, when he entered the world in the small town of Offenbach am Main, the region we now call Germany was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities, bound together loosely by language and culture, but not by any unified state. Offenbach itself sat just across the river from Frankfurt, close enough to see the spires of that great trading city, close enough to feel its influence and its commerce, but distinct in its own way. A town known for its leather goods and its printers, its skilled craftsmen, and its modest prosperity. The boy who would become Mainländer was born Philipp Batz, the fifth of 6 children in a family that had done well in the leather business. His father was a successful merchant, and the family lived in comfortable circumstances, not wealthy by the standards of the great industrial fortunes that were beginning to reshape European society, but secure, respectable, part of the solid middle class that formed the backbone of German civic life. There was money for books, money for education, money for the kind of careful upbringing that was supposed to produce another generation of respectable merchants, or perhaps, if the boy showed aptitude, a lawyer or a doctor. But from the beginning, there was something different about Philip. He was sensitive in a way that seemed to run deeper than ordinary childhood feeling, attuned to moods and atmospheres in a manner that sometimes made others uncomfortable. He read voraciously, far beyond what his schooling required, and he developed early an attachment to literature that would shape the entire course of his life. While other children played in the streets of Offenbach or helped with the family business, young Philippe retreated into books, into the world of words where things made sense in ways that the everyday world often did not. His mother noticed this sensitivity and worried about it in the way that mothers do. She was a devout woman, raised in the traditions of Protestant Christianity, and she saw in her son's inward nature something that needed to be guided, channeled, given proper form. Religion, she believed, would anchor him. Faith would provide the structure that his restless mind required. And so the household was one of regular prayer, of Sunday services, of biblical instruction, and moral teaching. The young Philip absorbed all of it, as sensitive children do, taking in not just the words but the feelings behind them, the awe and the fear, the promise of salvation, and the threat of damnation. The sense that life was a test and that somewhere, somehow, a great account was being kept. But even as a child, he asked questions that made the adults around him uneasy. If God was good, why did people suffer? If heaven awaited the faithful, why was the world so full of pain? These were the kinds of questions that every thinking person encounters at some point, but most learn to set them aside, to accept the standard answers, or to simply stop asking. Philip did not stop asking. The questions lodged in him like splinters that would not work themselves out, irritating and persistent, growing more troublesome as he grew older. At the age of 16, something happened that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. A friend introduced him to the works of Friedrich Schiller, the great German poet, playwright and philosopher whose writings had electrified an earlier generation, and whose influence still hung over German intellectual life like a vast shadow. Mainländer read Schiller and was transfixed. Here was language that seemed to touch something he had always felt but never been able to articulate, a vision of human nobility and tragic beauty that spoke directly to the deepest parts of his nature. He devoured everything Schiller had written, the plays, the poems, the aesthetic essays, and when he had finished, he went back and read them again. This was not simply an aesthetic preference. It was an awakening. Mainländer later described this period as a kind of conversion, a transformation as profound in its own way as any religious experience. Schiller became his saint, his ideal, the standard against which all other writing and thinking would be measured. And in Schiller's tragic vision, the belief that life was struggle, that nobility lay in defiance, that beauty and suffering were inextricably intertwined, the young Mainländer found something that his religious upbringing had never quite provided, a language for his own sense of the world's sorrow. But he was still a merchant's son, and merchants' sons did not become poets or philosophers. His father, practical and forward-looking, had different plans. The family business required expansion, new markets, new connections. And so, at the age of 17, Philipp was sent away from Offenbach, away from his books and his dreams, to begin a commercial apprenticeship in the great trading houses of Germany and beyond. He went first to Dresden, then to other cities, learning the trade that was supposed to be his future. He learned to keep accounts, to correspond with suppliers and buyers, to navigate the complex networks of credit and trust that made commerce possible. He was competent at it, even successful. He had inherited his father's head for business, his ability to see the patterns in numbers and the opportunities in markets. But his heart was never in it. During the long hours of work, his mind wandered to Schiller, to poetry, to the questions that would not leave him alone. At night, in whatever room he rented, he wrote poems at first, imitations of his beloved Schiller, and then longer works, dramas and essays that grew increasingly ambitious as his confidence developed. In 1858, when Mainländer was 17, an opportunity arose that seemed like a gift from fate itself. A position opened in Naples, in the Italian branch of a German trading firm, and Mainländer was offered the role. Italy, the land of Dante and Petrarch, of Renaissance art and ancient ruins, of warm light and the Mediterranean Sea. To a young man steeped in German romanticism, who had dreamed of beauty and culture from the confines of counting houses and ledgers, Italy represented everything that the commercial world was not. He accepted immediately. The journey south was a revelation. Crossing the Alps, watching the landscape change from the ordered forests of Germany to the wild mountains to the softer slopes of Lombardy, Mainländer felt something shift inside him. The world grew warmer, the colours richer, the pace of life slower and more sensuous. By the time he reached Naples, that sprawling, chaotic, beautiful city spread along its bay beneath the smoking bulk of Vesuvius, he was already a different person from the boy who had left Offenbach. Naples in the late 1850s was a city of contrast so stark they seemed almost theatrical. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies, of which Naples was the capital, was one of the oldest monarchies in Europe, but it was also one of the most backward, its society divided between a wealthy aristocracy and a vast population of the desperately poor. In the streets, elegant carriages rolled past beggars sleeping in doorways. In the churches, gold glittered on altars, while outside children went hungry. The beauty was real, the bay, the light, the ancient ruins of Pompeii visible in the distance. But so was the suffering, and Mainländer, with his sensitive nature and his restless mind, could not ignore either. He threw himself into Italian culture with the fervour of a convert. He learned the language quickly, fluently, and began reading the Italian poets in their original tongue. Dante above all, whose descent into the circles of hell and ascent to paradise seemed to speak directly to the spiritual questions that had haunted him since childhood. He visited the churches and museums, stood before Caravaggio's paintings and felt the dark intensity of those brushstrokes reach into his chest. He walked the streets of the city at all hours, observing the life that swirled around him, the gestures and rituals and sorrows of a people living under the weight of centuries. But he was still a merchant's apprentice, still bound to his desk and his ledgers, still fulfilling the expectations of his family back in Germany. The tension between what he was supposed to be and what he felt himself becoming grew more acute with each passing month. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with his poems and his reflections, but he could share these with no one. He was alone in a crowded city, surrounded by beauty and suffering in equal measure, feeling his ideas crystallize into shapes that the world around him would never understand. It was during these years in Naples that Mainländer first encountered the work of the philosopher who would ultimately transform his life, Arthur Schopenhauer. Someone, a friend, a fellow expatriate, a bookseller whose name has been lost to history, pressed a copy of The World as Will and Representation into his hands, and Mainländer began to read. The effect was seismic. Here, finally, was a thinker who addressed the questions that had tormented Mainländer since childhood, not with religious platitudes or philosophical evasions, but with a systematic account of why existence was suffering, why desire led only to more desire, why the world was not the rational creation of a benevolent God, but the blind manifestation of a purposeless will that strove eternally and could never be satisfied. Schopenhauer wrote that life was oscillation between pain and boredom, that happiness was merely the temporary absence of suffering, and that the only true wisdom lay in understanding and ultimately renouncing the will to live that kept the miserable cycle turning. For Mainländer, reading Schopenhauer was like discovering that the vague illness he had felt all his life had a name. Here was someone who had seen the same darkness, felt the same unease, and constructed from it a complete philosophical system. Schopenhauer put into rigorous argument what Mainländer had intuited from childhood, that something was wrong with existence itself, that the pain was not accidental but essential, that no amount of success or pleasure could address the fundamental problem, because the problem was being alive at all. He read everything Schopenhauer wrote. He read the main works and the essays, the aphorisms and the supplements. He memorized passages. He argued with the text, filling the margins with his agreements and his objections, already beginning to see where he thought the master had gone wrong, where the philosophy needed to be extended or corrected. Schopenhauer, for all his pessimism, still believed that life could be escaped through aesthetic contemplation or ascetic renunciation, temporary refugees from the will's grinding demands. But Mainländer was already beginning to suspect that these refugees were not enough, that the logic of pessimism led somewhere darker and more final than even Schopenhauer had been willing to go. But this was the 1860s, and the world beyond Naples was beginning to convulse with changes that would sweep away the old order forever. The Italian unification movement, the Risorgimento, was reaching its climax. Garibaldi and his red-shirted volunteers were marching through southern Italy, and the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the ancient monarchy that had ruled Naples for centuries, was crumbling. In 1860, while Mainländer worked at his desk and read his Schopenhauer in the evenings, the world outside his window was being remade. He watched it happen with the strange detachment of someone whose real life was elsewhere, in the realm of ideas rather than events. The fall of Naples to the forces of Italian unification was dramatic and chaotic. The last Bourbon king fleeing, the population torn between loyalty and relief, soldiers in the streets and uncertainty in the air. Mainländer recorded none of this in any document that survives. His attention, even amid the collapse of kingdoms, was fixed on questions that seemed to him far more significant than which flag flew over which city. Empires rose and fell, but the underlying structure of existence, the suffering that was woven into its very fabric, remained unchanged. The political upheaval did, however, force a practical decision. With the Italian economy in flux and the old trading networks disrupted, Mainländer's position in Naples became uncertain. His father, growing older and needing help with the family business back in Germany, summoned him home. And so, after nearly 5 years in Italy, years that had transformed him from a dreamy teenager into something harder and stranger, Mainländer returned to Offenbach. He was 22 years old. He had seen beauty and squalor in equal measure. He had discovered the philosopher who would shape his thinking for the rest of his life, and he had begun to feel, with increasing clarity, that the path laid out for him by his family, the path of commerce, respectability, the production of more Bats children to continue the line, was a path he could not walk. Something else was calling him, something that had no place in the orderly world of ledgers and leather goods. The family business absorbed him nevertheless. His father was aging, his health uncertain, and Philip was the capable son, the one with the head for numbers and the training in trade. He took up his duties, worked long hours, helped maintain the modest prosperity that his father had built. But something had shifted in him that could not be shifted back. The questions that had begun in childhood, that had deepened in Naples, that had found their sharpest articulation in Schopenhauer's unforgiving prose, these questions now occupied almost all of his inner life, leaving less and less room for the mundane tasks of commerce. He began to write in earnest. Not poetry now, not the imitative verses of his adolescence, but philosophy. Systematic attempts to work out what he was beginning to see as the truth about existence. He wrote at night after the day's work was done, in the same room where he had read Schiller as a boy, surrounded now by volumes of Schopenhauer and Kant, and the other thinkers who formed the background of German philosophy. The pages accumulated slowly, drafted and redrafted as his ideas took shape. What was emerging was something new, not merely an interpretation of Schopenhauer, but a departure from him, a philosophy that took Schopenhauer's pessimism as its starting point and then pushed further toward conclusions that the master himself had never reached. Where Schopenhauer saw the will to live as the fundamental reality, eternal and unchanging, Mainländer was beginning to see something else, a will that was not eternal but dying, a universe that was not sustained but collapsing, a God who was not absent but dead, dead by his own hand, and dead so that existence could occur. This was the seed of what would become the philosophy of redemption, though years would pass before Mainländer understood its full implications. For now it was a suspicion, a shape glimpsed in peripheral vision, a thought that kept returning no matter how often he tried to set it aside. If the world was as terrible as Schopenhauer claimed, if life really was suffering without purpose or end, then what did that say about whatever power had created it? Either God was cruel, which was unacceptable to any moral sense, or God was indifferent, which explained nothing, or, and here was the thought that would not leave him alone, God had somehow wanted the world to exist, and was himself caught up in the process of existence, suffering along with everything else, dying slowly through the medium of creation itself. But these were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that had no place in respectable society, thoughts that he could share with no one around him. His family saw him as the capable son who had returned from Italy and taken up his responsibilities. The people of Offenbach saw him as a merchant's heir, perhaps a bit quieter than most, but solid enough, reliable enough. No one knew what he was writing in the evenings, what abysses he was mapping in the silence of his room. His mother died in 1865. The loss struck him deeply. She had been, for all their differences in temperament, a constant presence in his life, a link to the religious certainties of his childhood that he had long since abandoned. He watched her funeral procession wind through the streets of Offenbach, and felt something close in him, some door that had been opened since boyhood finally swinging shut. She had believed in salvation, in a loving God who would gather his children to him after death. Mainländer believed none of it now, and watching her coffin lowered into the ground, he thought about death with a clarity that surprised him, not fearfully, not with the horror that most people seem to feel, but with a kind of calm curiosity. What was it really, this ending that waited for everyone? What happened to consciousness when the body failed? And why did people cling so desperately to life when life brought them mostly pain? His father followed a few years later, and suddenly Mainländer was free in a way he had never been before. The family business could be sold or delegated. The obligations that had bound him to Offenbach were dissolving one by one. He was in his late 20s now, unmarried, with no children to anchor him to the future, no responsibilities that he could not set aside. The path that had seemed so fixed, the path of commerce, of family, of respectability, had crumbled beneath his feet, and he found himself standing in open country with no map and no destination. What he did next revealed something essential about his character. Instead of doing what most men in his position would have done, taking over the family business, finding a wife, settling into the comfortable life that his parents had prepared for him, Mainländer began to simplify. He reduced his needs, reduced his possessions, reduced everything around him to the minimum necessary for survival. He was not poor. The family had left enough to live on modestly, but he was no longer interested in accumulation, in the endless process of acquiring things and maintaining them and passing them on. He wanted time, and time required freedom from the demands that consume most human lives. He moved into smaller rooms. He gave away what he did not need. He withdrew from social obligations, from the expectations of his remaining family, from everything that might distract him from the work that was now the only thing he cared about. The philosophy that had begun as scattered pages was growing into something larger, a systematic account of existence that would eventually fill more than 1,000 pages. He wrote compulsively, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch, emerging from his room pale and exhausted, looking, as one acquaintance later recalled, like a man who had been somewhere very far away and had not quite returned. The townspeople of Offenbach began to regard him with the uneasy mixture of pity and suspicion that small communities reserve for those who do not fit. "There goes Bats," they might have said, or perhaps they used the pen name he had already begun to adopt. Mainländer, meaning something like one from the mainland, a curious choice for a man who had never lived near any coast but his beloved Bay of Naples. Whatever they called him, they watched him with the wariness of people who sense that something is wrong but cannot quite name what it is. He was too thin, too pale, too absorbed in whatever it was he spent his days doing. He had become, in their eyes, a figure of the margins, neither quite mad nor quite normal, neither quite present nor quite gone. And still he wrote. The philosophy took shape, argument by argument, chapter by chapter. The core insight and the idea that would make his work both notorious and unforgettable crystallized into its final form. God, Mainländer wrote, had once existed as a unity, perfect and complete, but that unity was unbearable. Why? Because existence itself, even divine existence, was a burden, a suffering that even the infinite could not escape. And so God had chosen to die, to shatter himself into the countless fragments that now constituted the universe, dispersing his being into matter and energy and life, each fragment carrying within it the same drive that had motivated the original death, the will to stop, the longing for non-existence, the deep pull toward nothing. This was the philosophy of redemption. Redemption not through salvation, not through heaven, not through any continuation of existence in some better form, but redemption through ending, through the completion of the process God had begun, through the gradual return of all existence to the nothing from which it had never really emerged. Every death, in this view, was a small step toward the final silence. Every life that ended was a fragment of the divine will being fulfilled, and the conscious choice to end one's own life was not a sin or a failure, but the highest expression of the wisdom that Mainländer believed he had uncovered, the recognition that to cease existing was not a tragedy but a homecoming. It is difficult, from the safety of our own time, to convey how strange and disturbing these ideas were when they first appeared. Pessimism was not uncommon in 19th century European thought. Schopenhauer had made it almost fashionable, and the Romantic movement had long cultivated an aesthetic of melancholy and despair. But even Schopenhauer, for all his bleakness, had never gone this far. He had argued that life was suffering, but he had never argued that death was the solution, still less that a philosopher had any business advocating for it. He had recommended renunciation, contemplation, the cultivation of detachment, strategies for living with the terrible truth, not for escaping it through the final door. Mainländer had no such hesitation. His philosophy was not an argument for how to bear existence, but an argument for why existence should end, for why the universe itself was a process of winding down, and why human beings, with their capacity for conscious choice, had the unique privilege of participating voluntarily in that process. To die was to align oneself with the fundamental direction of reality. To cling to life was to resist the only movement that could bring peace. He did not shrink from the implications. He understood, with terrible clarity, that if his philosophy was true, then he himself would have to act on it. Any philosopher who believes something but does not live by it is a fraud, a mere producer of words. Mainländer would not be a fraud. He would complete his work, give his ideas to the world, and then demonstrate their truth in the only way that a philosophy of death could be demonstrated, by dying. But first, the work had to be finished. There were still chapters to write, arguments to refine, objections to anticipate and refute. And there was one more experience he wanted to have before the end, one more immersion in the world that would soon be closing behind him. In 1874, at the age of 33, Mainländer enlisted in the Prussian army. It was a strange choice for a philosopher of death, a man who believed that existence was suffering and non-existence was redemption. Why would such a person choose to spend a year in military service, subjected to discipline and hardship and the constant possibility of violence? The answer, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, was that Mainländer wanted to understand something about human beings that he could not learn from books, something about courage and cowardice, about the way men faced death when it came for them in battle, about the community that forms among soldiers and the strange nobility that can emerge even in the midst of destruction. He served for a little over a year. He was assigned to a regiment stationed in what is now Poland, far from the battlefields. Prussia was not at war in these years, and his service was mostly training and garrison duty. But he watched his fellow soldiers with the same intensity that he brought to everything, studying their fears and their hopes, their camaraderie and their cruelty. He endured the physical hardships without complaint, though his health, never robust, suffered under the strain. And at night, when the barracks fell quiet, he continued to write, adding pages to the manuscript that was now almost complete. The experience confirmed something he had suspected but never quite known, that most people did not want to die. They feared death, even the soldiers who talked bravely of glory and honour. When he listened to them speak of their families, their plans, their hopes for the future, he heard the voice of the will to live. The very thing his philosophy said was the source of all suffering. They wanted to continue. They wanted more time, more experience, more of whatever it was that life seemed to promise them, and they would fight to preserve it, would endure almost anything to avoid the ending that Mainlander believed was the only true redemption. He did not resent them for it. He did not even feel superior to them, not in any simple way. He understood that they were caught in the same trap that held everyone, that the will to live was not a choice but a condition, and that most people would never see past it. His philosophy was not for most people. It was for the few who could recognize the truth, who could see through the illusion of meaning that kept the others striving, and who could choose, consciously and deliberately, to stop. When his service ended in 1875, he returned to Offenbach with the manuscript nearly finished. A few more months of work, a few more revisions, a careful arrangement of the chapters, and it would be ready. He found a printer willing to take on the project, not a major publishing house, but a small firm that specialised in philosophical and academic works. The costs were considerable, but Mainlander had enough money left from his inheritance to cover them. He negotiated the terms, corrected the proofs, and waited for the printing to be completed. The spring of 1876 arrived. The books were printed, and on the day they were delivered to his room, the stacks of volumes with their fresh ink and their embossed spines, Philipp Mainländer arranged them on the floor, climbed onto the pile of his life's work, and stepped into the silence. He left no note. The book itself was the note, the longest suicide letter ever written. 1,000 pages explaining exactly why he was doing what he was doing and why it made sense. He had said everything he needed to say. The words were in the world now, and the man who had written them was no longer necessary. His body was found the next morning. The authorities recorded the death as suicide, and the local newspaper printed a brief notice. The people of Offenbach shook their heads and said what people always say when someone chooses to die, that it was a tragedy, that he must have been unwell, that no one had seen it coming. They did not know about the books. They did not know that the quiet, pale man who had lived among them for years had constructed an entire philosophy explaining why their lives were suffering and why death was not to be feared but welcomed. But others would learn. The books went out into the world, finding their way to readers who had never heard of Philipp Mainländer, who picked up this strange volume by an unknown author and began to read. And some of them, reading those careful arguments, feeling the terrible logic close around them, would make the same choice that Mainländer had made. The story of that aftermath, of how a philosopher's death became a kind of contagion, of how ideas written in a small German town spread outward and left bodies in their wake, is part of what makes Mainlander's case so difficult to set aside. But to understand it, we have to first understand what the philosophy actually said, how it constructed its argument, and why it held such power over certain kinds of minds. That understanding requires us to stay a while longer with the man himself, with the life that produced these ideas before we examine the ideas themselves. We have traced him from childhood to death, but we have moved quickly, and there are details we have passed over, moments of suffering and illumination that shaped the philosophy as much as any intellectual influence. There was his health, which had never been strong, and which deteriorated markedly in his final years, leaving him with physical pain that coloured his sense of what existence meant. There was his solitude, which grew more complete as he withdrew from society, until he was living almost entirely alone, speaking to almost no one, existing in a space so quiet that his own thoughts must have seemed deafeningly loud. And there was his sister, Minna, a figure who deserves more attention than she has received in most accounts of Mainlander's life. She was his closest companion in those final years, the one person who understood something of what he was doing and why. She typed his manuscript, helped with the correspondence to publishers, and watched him retreat further and further into the philosophy that was consuming him. After his death, she would take on the task of publishing his remaining works, including a second volume of The Philosophy of Redemption that he had nearly completed before his death. And then, a few years after finishing that task, Minna Mainländer would take her own life as well. But that is a part of the story we have not yet reached. For now, we are still in the spring of 1876, in the days just before the end, when a man surrounded by books that smell of fresh ink is making preparations that no one around him understands. The manuscript is finally solid, finally tangible, finally out of his head and into the world. The long years of writing are over. And the question that remains, the question that will hang over everything that follows, is simply this. Was he right? Not right in some abstract philosophical sense, not right in a way that academics might debate in their journals and seminars, but right in the way that matters, right about what existence is, right about what it costs to be alive, right about what awaits when the noise finally stops. That question cannot be answered. It sits at the centre of Mainlander's philosophy like a stone at the bottom of a well, unmoved by all the words that have been written about it. But we can at least trace its shape, follow the arguments that led him to his conclusion, and try to understand why those arguments prove so compelling. Compelling enough to end not just one life, but, reportedly, many more. The philosophy begins, as all 19th century German philosophy seems to begin, with Kant. But where other thinkers of Mainlander's era took Kant's great insight, that we cannot know the world as it truly is, only the world as it appears to us, and built elaborate systems that promise some kind of redemption, some hidden harmony, some ultimate justification for the suffering of existence. Mainlander took that same insight and followed it somewhere far darker. He began where Schopenhauer had begun, with the recognition that behind the veil of appearances lies something that does not care about us, something that drives the whole machinery of existence without purpose or compassion. Schopenhauer had called this thing the will, a blind, striving force that surges through all living creatures, compelling them to desire, to reproduce, to struggle, and ultimately to suffer. Every act of wanting is an act of suffering, because wanting implies lack, and lack is pain. The momentary satisfactions we achieve are just brief pauses in an endless cycle of craving, a wheel that turns and turns without ever arriving anywhere. This was already bleak enough. Schopenhauer's philosophy offered a vision of existence as fundamentally tragic, a prison from which the only escapes were aesthetic contemplation, compassion for other suffering beings, and the eventual dissolution of the individual will through a kind of ascetic renunciation. But Schopenhauer, for all his pessimism, stopped short of certain conclusions. He remained, in his own way, a philosopher of survival. He lived to be 72 years old, enjoyed good food and wine, kept a succession of beloved poodles, and died peacefully in his armchair after breakfast. Whatever his philosophy said about the horror of existence, his life suggested that one could think these thoughts and still find reasons to continue. Mainlander looked at Schopenhauer's system and saw something incomplete. He saw a philosopher who had diagnosed the disease but flinched from the cure, and so he set out to complete the work, to follow the logic wherever it led, even if, especially if, it led somewhere from which there was no return. The first and most radical move Mainlander made was to rethink the nature of the will itself. For Schopenhauer, the will was eternal and indestructible, a metaphysical constant that would go on striving forever regardless of what happened to any individual being. This was part of what made his pessimism bearable, in a strange way. The suffering was endless, but it was also somehow abstract, distributed across an infinite cosmic process rather than concentrated in any single life. But Mainlander saw this as a kind of dodge, an attempt to preserve something permanent and absolute at the heart of reality, when the whole thrust of modern philosophy pointed toward the dissolution of such comforting fictions. What if, Mainlander asked, there is no eternal will? What if the thing that drives existence is not an immortal force but a dying one? What if the fundamental truth of reality is not endless striving, but a movement toward ending, toward silence, toward the cessation of all movement whatsoever? This was the thought that changed everything. It was, in its own terrible way, a kind of liberation, and also a kind of damnation. Mainlander proposed that at the beginning of everything, if one can speak of a beginning for something that precedes time and space, there was a simple, unified God. Not the personal God of Christianity, not a loving Father watching over his creation, but a metaphysical absolute, a unity so complete that it contained nothing but itself. This God, this original unity, possessed no world to contemplate, no other to relate to, nothing but its own perfect self-identity. And this, Mainlander argued, was the problem. Perfect unity, perfect self-sufficiency, perfect being. These sound like ideals to us, the kinds of things we think we want. But for the original God, this perfection was a prison. To be everything is also to be nothing in particular. To lack nothing is also to lack the possibility of change, of growth, of movement, of meaning. The absolute, in its very completeness, was utterly empty. And so, according to Mainlander, this God chose to die. Not to transform, not to evolve, not to create something else while remaining intact. To die. To will its own annihilation, to shatter itself into fragments that would slowly, across the immense reaches of time and space, move toward the complete dissolution that the original unity desired but could not achieve in a single stroke. The world we inhabit, the universe we study, the lives we lead, all of it is the corpse of God, the scattered debris of that original suicide still in the process of completing itself, still moving inexorably toward the nothing that was the object of the divine will. This is not a metaphor, or rather, if it is a metaphor, it is one that Mainlander took with absolute seriousness, following out its implications with a rigour that borders on the obsessive. Every particle of matter, every flicker of consciousness, every living being, every star burning in the empty reaches of space, all of it is moving toward extinction, not because existence is punishing us, not because we have sinned or failed, but because the fundamental nature of reality is a will to death, a longing for non-being that was present from the very first moment, and that will only be satisfied when the last trace of existence has finally flickered out. You can see why this philosophy held a certain terrible appeal. It took all the suffering of existence, all the pain and loss and disappointment, all the moments when being alive feels like a punishment for some crime you cannot remember committing. And it said, yes, you're right to feel that way. The universe agrees with you. The deepest truth of reality is that existence is a burden, and the only genuine peace is the peace of not existing at all. Everything that lives is trying, whether it knows it or not, to return to the nothing from which it came. But Mainlander was not simply offering despair. He was offering, in his own strange way, hope. The hope of an ending, the promise that the suffering would not continue forever. The universe was not, as Schopenhauer had suggested, an eternal wheel of torment. It was a process with a direction, a movement toward a goal, and that goal was cessation. Every death in Mainlander's system was a victory. Every extinction, every dissolution, every moment when something that existed stopped existing. All of it was progress toward the ultimate peace, the heat death of the universe, the final cooling of the last stars, the eventual dispersal of all matter into an endless, changeless void. This was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a consummation to be welcomed. The fulfillment of the deepest wish that had been present in reality since the very beginning. And here is where the philosophy becomes not just intellectually radical, but existentially dangerous. Because if Mainlander is right, if the fundamental nature of reality is a will to death, if every living being is unconsciously striving toward its own extinction, then what does that imply for how we should live? What does it mean for the choices we make, for the value we place on survival, for the instinctive horror we feel at the thought of dying? Mainlander was careful, at least in his written work, not to recommend suicide explicitly. He understood that such a recommendation would be both morally problematic and philosophically unsophisticated. The will to death, as he conceived it, was not the same as the conscious desire to end one's life. It operated at a deeper level, beneath the surface of awareness, driving all the processes of existence toward their eventual conclusion, whether or not the beings involved understood or wished for it. In some ways, this made suicide unnecessary. Death would come regardless, and the cosmic process would continue whether any particular individual hastened their own end or waited for nature to complete the work. But there was another strand in Mainlander's thought, one that complicated this apparent neutrality. He argued that certain individuals, those who had achieved the highest level of philosophical insight, could recognize the will to death operating within themselves and could align their conscious intentions with that deeper drive. They could, in other words, see through the illusions that kept most people clinging to life, the hope for happiness, the fear of the unknown, the animal instinct for self-preservation, and embrace the truth that existence itself was trying to end. For such individuals, suicide was not a desperate act of despair, but a kind of enlightenment, a final affirmation of the deepest truth about reality. This is the teaching that proved fatal. Not for everyone who read it. Most readers presumably encountered these ideas and set them aside, or absorbed them intellectually without feeling compelled to act on them, or found in them a strange comfort that actually helped them endure. But for some, for a certain type of mind, prone to depression perhaps, or suffering from circumstances that made life feel unbearable, or simply possessed of a relentless logical rigour that refused to stop where other people would stop, Mainlander's philosophy offered something like permission. It told them that their despair was not a failure of will or a symptom of illness, but a glimpse of the truth, a recognition of what existence really was. And it suggested, however carefully the argument was hedged, that to act on that despair might be not just understandable but correct. To understand the power of this teaching, you have to understand the peculiar position of certain readers in the late 19th century. This was an era when traditional religious belief was collapsing for many educated Europeans, when the old certainties about God and heaven and the meaning of suffering were becoming impossible to maintain, but when nothing had yet arisen to take their place. People who had been raised to believe in a divine order, in a universe that made sense, in rewards after death that would compensate for the pains of life. These people were suddenly confronted with a world that seemed empty of meaning, ruled by blind physical laws that cared nothing for human hopes or values. Many of them turned to philosophy, looking for some new framework that could replace the religious beliefs they had lost. And some of them found Mainlander. What he offered was, in a perverse way, a kind of substitute religion. It gave them back a sense of cosmic meaning, even if that meaning was negative rather than positive. The universe was not random and purposeless after all. It had a direction, a goal, a hidden logic beneath the chaos of experience. That goal happened to be annihilation rather than salvation, but at least it was something. At least it explained why things felt the way they felt, why existence seemed so heavy, why the promise of happiness always receded before one could grasp it. The suffering made sense now. It was not arbitrary cruelty, but the birth pangs of a universe labouring toward its own death. And for some readers, the act of suicide became not a sin or a failure, but a kind of participation in the divine plan, or rather, the post-divine plan, the great unwinding of existence that had been set in motion when God chose to destroy itself. To kill oneself was to align one's will with the will of the universe, to accelerate in one's own small way the process that was destined to end everything. It was, in the twisted logic of Mainlander's system, an act of religious devotion, a final sacrament in the church of non-being. The stories of those who followed Mainlander into death are fragmentary and often second-hand, which has led some scholars to question whether they happened at all. Perhaps the tales of devotees using his book as a stepping stool to reach the noose were exaggerated, embellished over time into a kind of grim mythology. Perhaps the real number of deaths attributable to his philosophy was smaller than legend suggests, or larger, if one counts all the quiet suicides whose connection to these ideas was never recorded. What we know for certain is that Mainlander's work did circulate, did find readers, and did acquire a reputation as a dangerous text, the kind of book that decent people should not be exposed to, that libraries might think twice before putting on their shelves. That reputation became part of the work's identity, inseparable from its content. To read Mainlander was to engage in something slightly forbidden, slightly reckless, like handling a substance that might be poison, and this, inevitably, attracted a certain type of reader, the reader who was already drawn to darkness, already questioning whether life was worth living, already looking for a philosophy that would confirm suspicions they had never been able to articulate. But we should be careful not to reduce Mainlander's thought to its most sensational aspect. The philosophy of redemption was not simply an argument for suicide dressed up in metaphysical language. It was a genuine attempt to grapple with the hardest questions. Questions about the nature of reality, the problem of suffering, the relationship between the individual will and the cosmos, the meaning or meaninglessness of existence. Mainlander read widely and thought deeply, engaging with the scientific ideas of his time as well as the philosophical traditions he inherited. He tried to reconcile the insights of physics and biology with his metaphysical vision, arguing that the law of entropy, the tendency of all systems to move toward disorder and equilibrium, was simply the scientific expression of the will to death he had identified at the heart of being. In this sense, he was ahead of his time, the existentialist of the 20th century, the philosophers who would grapple with meaninglessness and absurdity, the scientists who would contemplate the ultimate fate of the universe, all of them were working in territory that Mainländer had already explored. He saw, decades before it became common knowledge, that the universe was not eternal, that it was running down, that the stars would burn out and the galaxies would scatter, and everything would eventually dissolve into an empty, cold, changeless void. He saw this and he said, "Good. This is what should happen. This is what reality has always wanted." Whether this vision is accurate, whether it captures something true about the nature of existence, or whether it is simply the projection of one man's suffering onto the cosmos, is a question that cannot be settled. Philosophy has never been able to prove or disprove its deepest claims about the nature of reality. What it can do is articulate positions, trace out their implications, and leave the reader to judge whether the picture it presents resonates with their own experience. Mainländer's picture resonated with some. It repelled others. It left almost no one entirely unmoved. To spend time with his arguments, even now, more than a century after they were written, is to feel something of their strange power. There is a relentlessness to his logic, a willingness to follow thoughts to their conclusions no matter how uncomfortable those conclusions might be. He does not flinch, does not comfort, does not offer the reader any escape. "This is what I see," he seems to say. "This is where the evidence points. If you disagree, show me where I went wrong." And it is surprisingly difficult to show where he went wrong. One can reject his premises. One can deny that existence is fundamentally characterized by suffering, or that the will to death is the deepest truth of reality, or that the original unity ever existed and chose to destroy itself. But if one accepts the premises, the conclusions follow with a terrible inevitability. This is what makes dangerous philosophy dangerous. It is not that it is obviously false. It is that it constructs a world so internally consistent that once you step inside it, all the exits seem to close behind you. Mainländer spent his final years inside that world, living the philosophy he had created, or perhaps being lived by it. The writing was finished. The book was printed. The long labour of articulating his vision was complete. And now there was nothing left to do but enact what the philosophy implied, to become the living proof, or rather, the dying proof, that he believed what he had written. The details of his final days are sparse, reconstructed from what his sister remembered and from the few documents that survive. He had grown very thin by this point, the physical illness that had plagued him for years now advancing unchecked. He barely ate. He spent long hours alone in his room, surrounded by the copies of his book that had been delivered from the printer. Whether he reread his own words during those final days, looking for flaws or finding confirmation, we do not know. Perhaps the book had become so familiar that he no longer needed to read it. The arguments lived inside him now, indistinguishable from the contours of his own mind. He set his affairs in order with the same methodical care he had brought to everything else. There were letters to write, arrangements to make, loose ends to tie. He ensured that his sister would have what she needed to continue the work of publishing the remaining manuscripts. He left instructions, though what exactly those instructions said has been lost or suppressed over the years. And then, on a morning in April, with the spring light coming in through the windows and the smell of fresh printed pages still lingering in the air, Philipp Mainländer made his preparations. He took copies of his own book, accounts vary on how many, 2 or 3 or perhaps more, and he stacked them on the floor of his room. He stood on them to reach a rope he had fastened to something above, a beam or a hook, or whatever anchor point the architecture of that small German house provided. And then he stepped off his own philosophy, using the arguments he had spent years refining, as the literal platform for his final act. The rope did what ropes do. The body did what bodies do when deprived of air. And by the time anyone found him, the man who had written The Philosophy of Redemption had found whatever redemption his philosophy promised. His sister was the one who discovered him. We can only imagine what that moment was like for Minna Mainländer, walking into the room and seeing her brother hanging there, his feet just inches above the stacked volumes that bore his name. She had known he was suffering. She had watched him withdraw, had seen the brightness leave his eyes, had typed the very words that articulated his longing for non-being. But knowing something intellectually and encountering it in the flesh are different things. The body of a hangman does not look peaceful. It does not look like someone who has found what they were searching for. It looks like violence, like violation, like something that should not be. and yet Minna did not turn away from her brother's work. In the weeks and months after his death, while she was still absorbing the shock, while she was still trying to understand what had happened and why, she took on the task he had left for her. There was a second volume of The Philosophy of Redemption, nearly complete at the time of his death, and Philip had asked her to see it through to publication. So she did. She edited the remaining manuscripts, negotiated with printers, handled the correspondence that a 19th century publication required. She became the guardian of her brother's legacy, the keeper of his flame, such as it was. This would have been a difficult task under any circumstances. To promote and preserve a philosophy that had led its author to suicide while still mourning that suicide, while still trying to make sense of one's own grief and loss. There is something almost heroic about it, or perhaps something beyond heroism, something that exceeds the categories we normally use to describe human courage. Minna Mainländer was not herself a philosopher. She did not claim to have achieved the same understanding her brother had reached. But she believed in him, believed that his work deserved to be read, and she gave years of her life to ensuring that it would be. The second volume appeared in due course, finding its way to some of the same readers who had encountered the first. It expanded on the arguments Mainländer had made, filled in gaps, responded to objections he had anticipated. It was the work of a mind that had thought deeply about what it was doing, that had taken seriously the task of building a complete philosophical system, rather than simply throwing off provocative claims. Whether it convinced anyone who had not already been convinced by the first volume is hard to say. By the time it appeared, Mainländer's name was already associated primarily with his death rather than his ideas. He was becoming a legend, a cautionary tale, a figure in a story about the dangers of thinking too much about the wrong things. And then, a few years after completing her work on the second volume, after ensuring that her brother's philosophy had been given to the world as completely as she could manage, Minna Mainländer took her own life. She did not leave behind a detailed explanation. There was no philosophical treatise from Minna, no carefully reasoned argument for why she had chosen to follow her brother into death. Just the act itself, stark and final, one more body in the wake of a philosophy that seemed to produce bodies the way other philosophies produce books and lectures and academic careers. We do not know the method she chose. We do not know if she stood on a stack of her brother's volumes, whether that grim symmetry appealed to her or horrified her, or simply never occurred to her as a possibility. What we know is that she finished her work, saw it through to the end, and then she ended herself. There is something in this sequence of events that resists easy interpretation. It would be simple to say that Minna Mainländer was overwhelmed by grief, that the loss of her brother pushed her into a depression from which she never recovered, that her suicide was essentially a personal tragedy dressed in philosophical clothing. And perhaps that explanation contains some truth. Grief does terrible things to people. The loss of a sibling, particularly one with whom you have been as close as Philip and Minna evidently were, can create a wound that never fully heals. Some people carry that wound for decades. Others find they cannot carry it at all. But to reduce Minna's death entirely to grief is to ignore the years that intervened. She did not kill herself in the immediate aftermath of finding her brother's body. She did not kill herself while the shock was still fresh and the world still seemed unreal. She spent years working on his behalf, engaging deeply with his ideas, immersing herself in a philosophy that argued, with relentless consistency, that non-existence was preferable to existence. And then, when that work was done, she chose non-existence. Perhaps she was convinced. Perhaps in the long hours of editing and transcribing and corresponding with publishers, she'd come to see the world through her brother's eyes. Perhaps his arguments, which had seemed abstract and distant when she first heard them, had gradually taken on the weight of lived truth. She had watched him suffer. She had watched him struggle against his own existence. And she had seen him find peace, if peace is what one calls it, in death. Maybe the philosophy stopped being a set of propositions she was helping to disseminate, and became instead a map, a guide, a set of directions leading to the same destination her brother had reached. Or perhaps something else entirely was happening. Perhaps Minna Mainländer had her own reasons for wanting to die, reasons that had nothing to do with philosophical argument and everything to do with the particular texture of her particular life. The historical record is thin. She does not speak to us the way her brother does, through hundreds of pages of careful argument. She's a figure in his story, a supporting character whose inner life remains largely opaque. We know what she did. We do not know, with any certainty, why she did it. What we can say is that her death became part of the legend. The philosopher who killed himself the day his book was printed was already a striking figure. The sister who devoted herself to preserving his work and then followed him into death made the story darker still, suggested that there was something contagious about this philosophy, something that spread from mind to mind and produced, wherever it took root, the same terrible fruit. And Minna was not the last. In the years following the publication of Mainlander's work, reports began to circulate of other deaths. Readers who encountered the philosophy of redemption absorbed its arguments and then acted on them. The details of these reports are difficult to verify from our distance of more than a century. They exist primarily as rumours, as anecdotes passed from one source to another, acquiring embellishments and losing specificity with each retelling. But the pattern they describe is consistent enough to deserve attention. A young man in Leipzig, they said, who had been studying philosophy at the university, came across Mainlander's first volume in a bookshop. He took it back to his rooms, read it over the course of several days, and then hanged himself. His friends reported that he had seemed calm in his final weeks, perhaps even happier than usual, as if he had discovered something that resolved a tension he had been carrying for years. A woman in Munich, unmarried, in her 30s, who had been struggling with questions of meaning and purpose, found in Mainlander's work an answer she had not expected. She walked into the river one autumn evening, her pockets weighted with stones. The book was found in her apartment, heavily annotated in her own hand, the margins filled with notes that suggested she had not merely read the philosophy, but had wrestled with it, argued with it, and ultimately surrendered to it. A circle of readers in Berlin, young men and women who had formed a kind of informal study group around Mainlander's ideas, discussing them in cafes and private homes. 3 members of this circle took their own lives within the span of 18 months. Whether they had made a pact or whether each death simply made the next one more thinkable is impossible to say. The group dissolved after the 3rd death, its surviving members scattering into other pursuits, other philosophies, other ways of being alive. How many of these stories are true? How many are exaggerations or fabrications or cases where a death that would have happened anyway was retroactively attributed to the influence of a book? We cannot know with certainty. The record-keeping of the late 19th century was uneven, and suicides in particular were often hushed up, attributed to other causes, hidden from public view by families who found the truth unbearable. For every death that entered the rumour mill, there may have been others that left no trace at all, or there may have been fewer deaths than the rumours suggested, the same handful of stories repeated and multiplied until they seemed like an epidemic. But even if we discount the most extravagant claims, even if we assume that many of these reports were embellished or invented, there remains a core of something real here. Mainlander's philosophy was not merely a set of abstract propositions about the nature of being, it was a philosophy that explicitly affirmed suicide as a rational response to the human condition. It did not merely tolerate self-destruction, it valorized it. To die willingly in Mainlander's system was to align oneself with the deepest truth of the universe. It was to participate consciously in the process that everything else participated in unconsciously. It was, in his word, redemption. And so when someone who had read and absorbed this philosophy took their own life, they were not acting against the philosophy's recommendations. They were enacting them. They were doing what the philosophy suggested was the highest and most honest thing a human being could do. This is what made Mainlander's work different from other pessimistic philosophies that circulated in the same era. Schopenhauer had been pessimistic too, had argued that existence was suffering and that the will to live was a curse. But Schopenhauer had stopped short of endorsing suicide. He had recommended aesthetic contemplation, ascetic renunciation, the gradual quieting of the will through discipline and detachment. He had offered ways to live with the recognition that life was suffering, ways to endure without demanding that the universe provide meaning it could not provide. Mainlander offered no such compromise. His philosophy drove straight toward its logical conclusion and then over the edge. If existence is the problem, if being itself is what must be overcome, then the solution is obvious. Stop being. And the cleaner and more decisive the stoppage, the better. There is no room in Mainlander's system for halfway measures, for the aesthetic pleasures that Schopenhauer recommended, for the ascetic disciplines that might soften the blow of existence. There is only the stark choice between continuing to exist, which is to participate in cosmic suffering, and ceasing to exist, which is to achieve the peace that the universe itself is slowly, painfully moving toward. This starkness may explain why his work found the readers it found. There is a certain type of person, at a certain point in their life, for whom philosophical ambiguity feels unbearable. They want an answer, not a way of living with the question. They want to know what they should do, not how they might learn to tolerate uncertainty. And Mainländer gave them an answer. It was a terrible answer, but it had the virtue of clarity. You do not have to wrestle endlessly with the question of how to live a meaningful life in a meaningless universe. You do not have to figure out how to go on when going on seems impossible. There is an exit. Mainländer not only described it, but walked through it himself. We can imagine how this might have appealed to someone already struggling. The young man in Leipzig who had been trying to make sense of his existence, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with his life, trying to find some foothold in a world that seemed increasingly alien and hostile. He opens a book and finds a philosopher who speaks directly to his condition. Yes, the philosopher says, you're right to feel this way. Existence is suffering. The world is not what it should be, and here is what you can do about it. Or the woman in Munich who had watched her youth slip away, who had seen the possibilities that once seemed infinite narrow down to almost nothing, who lay awake at night wondering what the point of any of it was. She opens a book and finds someone who does not tell her she's being dramatic, who does not offer platitudes about finding meaning and counting blessings. Someone who takes her despair seriously, who honours it, who says, this feeling you have is not a symptom of illness, it is a perception of the truth, and the truth, painful as it is, points toward a solution. There is a dark seductiveness to this kind of philosophy. It validates suffering instead of pathologizing it. It tells the sufferer that they are seeing clearly, that their pain is not a distortion but a revelation, and it offers a way out that is perfectly clean, perfectly final, perfectly consistent with the vision of reality it has presented. Most philosophies ask you to keep living, to find a way forward, to make accommodations with a world that may never feel like home. Mainländer asks no such thing. He meets you in your despair and agrees with you, and then he points toward the door. We should be careful here not to romanticize this process. The people who died after reading Mainländer did not achieve some kind of philosophical enlightenment. They died. Their deaths were permanent. Whatever they were experiencing before they took their own lives, whatever combination of pain and confusion and despair drove them to that point, they did not solve it by dying. They simply stopped experiencing anything at all. There is no evidence that the cessation of existence is preferable to the continuation of existence, because there is no one there to prefer it. The dead have no preferences, they have no relief, they have nothing. And yet the deaths kept happening. Not in numbers that would register as a public health crisis, perhaps, but enough that people noticed. Enough that Mainländer's name became associated with a particular kind of danger. He was not merely a pessimist or a provocateur, he was a philosopher whose readers died. Parents warned their children away from his work. Professors declined to assign him even as a curiosity. The second volume of The Philosophy of Redemption sold fewer copies than the first, and the third volume, which Mainländer had planned but never completed, existed only in fragments that Minna had not had time to assemble before her own death. The philosophy began to disappear, not because it had been refuted, not because better arguments had driven it from the intellectual marketplace, but because it was too dangerous to handle. It was like a vial of poison on a library shelf. You could leave it there, and it might sit undisturbed for years or decades, or someone might find it, open it out of curiosity, and never walk back out. By the turn of the 20th century, Mainländer was largely forgotten. His books went out of print. His name dropped from the standard histories of philosophy. The great pessimist of the 19th century became Schopenhauer, whose work was dark enough to seem serious, but not so dark that it killed people. The younger pessimist, the one who had taken Schopenhauer's ideas to their logical extreme and then lived them, faded into obscurity. When people spoke of the death drive, they meant Freud. When they spoke of nihilism, they meant Nietzsche, who had at least offered the Übermensch as a way forward. Mainländer had offered nothing but the abyss, and the abyss, it seemed, had swallowed him. There were a few who remembered. Scattered scholars, mostly in Germany, who kept his books on their shelves and occasionally pulled them down to see if they held anything worth recovering. A small press edition of the first volume appeared in the 1920s. found a handful of readers, and disappeared again. There was no Mainlander revival, no academic renaissance, no attempt to rehabilitate him as a misunderstood genius. He had written himself into a corner that no one wanted to enter, and yet the questions he raised did not go away. The 20th century, that century of unprecedented violence and unprecedented questioning, returned again and again to the problems Mainlander had tried to solve. What is the meaning of existence in a godless universe? How should we respond to the recognition that suffering is built into the fabric of being? Is there something wrong with existence itself, or only with the way we live? These questions drove the existentialists who tried to face the void without flinching. They drove the absurdists who tried to laugh at the void instead of being crushed by it. They drove the nihilists and the hedonists and the religious revivalists who recoiled from the void and tried to fill it with something, anything, that might give life meaning. All of these movements were, in a sense, responses to the problem Mainlander had articulated with such terrible clarity. But none of them cited him. None of them acknowledged that a German clerk had seen all of this more than a century ago and had drawn the most radical possible conclusion. Perhaps this was a kind of protective forgetting. Perhaps the collective unconscious of Western philosophy knew, at some level, that there were doors that should remain closed, arguments that should not be followed to their endpoints, truths that were true but also deadly. To engage seriously with Mainlander was to risk becoming like him. Better to reinvent pessimism from scratch, to discover the void for yourself, to build your own systems for coping with meaninglessness, than to read the work of a man who had coped by dying. And yet there is something unsatisfying about this forgetting. A philosophy does not become false because its author killed himself. The arguments in The Philosophy of Redemption do not refute themselves simply because they led their creator to suicide. If anything, Mainlander's death could be seen as a mark of intellectual honesty, a willingness to live, or rather to stop living, according to his own principles. We do not discount Socrates because he drank the hemlock. We do not dismiss Seneca because he opened his veins. Why should Mainlander's death count against his ideas rather than in their favour? This is the uncomfortable question that his work raises, the question that perhaps explains why so many have chosen not to engage with it at all. To take Mainlander seriously is to risk being persuaded, and to be persuaded by Mainlander is, in the most literal sense, to be in danger. His ideas are not safe to hold. They do not sit quietly in the mind, providing interesting material for essays and seminars. They demand action. They insist on a conclusion. Most philosophies can be held at arm's length. You can read Kant and appreciate his arguments without restructuring your entire life around the categorical imperative. You can read Nietzsche and feel the thrill of his rhetoric without actually becoming an Übermensch. Philosophy, for most readers, is a spectator sport. You watch the great minds wrestle with the great questions, and then you go home and live your ordinary life, perhaps slightly enriched by the encounter, but fundamentally unchanged. Mainlander does not permit this distance. His philosophy is not a performance to be watched, but a conclusion to be enacted. Either you believe him, and you die, or you disbelieve him, and you live. There is no third option, no way to hold his ideas without being held by them. This is why his work disappeared. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, too consistent, too demanding of those who took it seriously. And so we arrive at a paradox. The very qualities that make Mainlander's philosophy compelling are also the qualities that make it dangerous. He did not hedge, he did not equivocate. He followed his arguments wherever they led, and they led him off a stack of his own books with a rope around his neck. This kind of integrity is rare in philosophy. It is also, in Mainlander's case, indistinguishable from pathology. Or perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps what we call pathology is simply the clarity to see what others refuse to see, and the courage to act on that clarity. The question of whether Mainlander was a genius or a madman may be unanswerable. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the line between those two things is thinner than we like to believe. Genius, after all, is partly defined by the ability to see what others cannot see, and madness is partly defined by the inability to look away from what one sees. Mainlander saw the void at the heart of existence, and he could not look away. He stared into it until it became, for him, the only thing there was. And then he stepped into it. But before he stepped, he wrote it all down. He left a map of the territory he had explored, a guide to the darkness he had found. And that map, that guide, sat on library shelves and in rare book collections, waiting for the readers who would find it, waiting to offer them the same clarity it had offered him, waiting to lead them, if they were willing to follow, to the same destination. The readers who found him didn't find him by accident. There is a particular kind of person who seeks out the forbidden corners of philosophy, who feels instinctively that the cheerful answers are not quite sufficient, that somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary thought there must be darker truths waiting to be uncovered. These are the readers who eventually arrive at Mainlander's door. They come by different paths. Some come through Schopenhauer, following the pessimist tradition to its logical conclusion, and discovering that Schopenhauer himself was, in Mainlander's view, not quite brave enough to follow his own arguments. Some come through the history of suicide, researching the philosophical justifications for self-destruction, and finding that Mainlander provides the most complete and systematic one ever written. Some come through the study of 19th century German philosophy, stumbling across his name in footnotes and obscure references, wondering who this forgotten thinker was and why his work vanished so completely from the canon. And some come simply because they are suffering. They are looking for something that speaks to their pain, something that does not try to convince them that things are better than they seem, something that acknowledges the darkness they feel and takes it seriously. For these readers, Mainlander offers a strange kind of comfort, not the comfort of hope or reassurance, but the comfort of recognition. The comfort of being told that yes, you have seen truly, the world really is as terrible as you suspected, and your suffering is not a mistake or a failure but a perception of reality as it actually is. This is the seduction of pessimism, and Mainlander is its most seductive voice. He does not argue his case coldly, like an academic presenting a thesis. He speaks with the passion of someone who has lived what he describes, someone who has felt the weight of existence pressing down on him, and has found only one way to lift it. His prose, in the original German, has a hymn-like quality, a strange beauty that makes his conclusions feel not just logical but poetic, not just true but inevitable. To read him is to be drawn into his way of seeing, to have your own perception gradually coloured by his until the world begins to look the way he said it looked. This is the danger his early critics warned about. This is why the rumours of suicide clusters among his readers have persisted for more than a century. The evidence for these clusters is, it must be said, thin. There are stories, passed from one account to another, of young men in Germany and Austria who read Mainlander and then killed themselves, sometimes leaving notes that quoted his work or referenced his ideas. But the stories are hard to verify. Names are rarely given. Dates are vague. The claims have a quality of legend about them, the kind of cautionary tale that cultures create around dangerous ideas to warn people away from them. It is possible that the suicide clusters were exaggerated, that Mainlander's reputation as a killer of readers was partly a myth constructed by those who wanted to discredit him, or simply by those who found his story too compelling not to embellish. And yet the myth itself is revealing. Whether or not dozens of readers actually killed themselves after reading Mainlander, the fact that people believed they did tells us something about how his work was received, how powerful it was felt to be. Philosophies do not acquire reputations for lethality unless there is something in them that genuinely disturbs. The fear that Mainlander might persuade you, that his arguments might get inside your head and change the way you see everything. This fear was real even if the body count was not, and this fear was enough to ensure that his work remained outside the mainstream, passed along quietly among those who sought it out, never assigned in universities, never included in the standard histories of philosophy. The few scholars who have examined the evidence for the suicide clusters tend to reach cautious conclusions. There were certainly some readers who killed themselves, and who had read Mainlander, but establishing causation is nearly impossible. People who are already contemplating suicide are drawn to philosophies that justify their thinking. It is difficult to know whether Mainlander created suicidal thoughts in healthy minds, or simply provided a framework for thoughts that were already present. The question is perhaps unanswerable, and perhaps it misses the point. The real question is not how many people Mainlander killed, but what it means that his philosophy was thought capable of killing at all. What does it say about the power of ideas that a book, a mere arrangement of words on paper, could be considered a weapon? What does it say about the fragility of the will to live that it could be undermined by arguments? These are the questions that Mainlander's legacy raises, questions that go far beyond his individual case and touch on the deepest assumptions we hold about reason, meaning, and the relationship between thought and action. There is a particular reader we might imagine, not a historical figure but a type, the kind of person who would have found Mainlander most compelling. He is young, probably in his 20s, educated but not yet established in a career or a family. He has read philosophy widely but has found nothing that quite satisfies him. The optimistic systems strike him as naive, the religious frameworks as wishful thinking, the materialist philosophies as incomplete. He feels that something is wrong with existence itself, something that cannot be fixed by changing circumstances or achieving goals. He has perhaps experienced depression, though he would not use that word. He would say that he has seen through the illusions that sustain other people, that he perceives something they cannot or will not perceive. He is isolated, not necessarily physically but spiritually, cut off from the easy faith that allows others to go on living without asking too many questions. And then he finds Mainlander. He reads the philosophy of redemption, and for the first time in his life he feels understood. Here is someone who has seen what he has seen, who has followed the dark thoughts to their conclusion instead of flinching away. Here is a system that explains why existence feels the way it does, why the ordinary pleasures do not satisfy, why the future holds no promise. Here is an answer. The answer, of course, is death. Not just acceptance of death, not just readiness for death, but active pursuit of death as the proper response to having understood the truth about existence. For this young reader, Mainlander's philosophy would offer not just intellectual satisfaction, but a kind of permission. You are not wrong to feel the way you feel. You are not sick or broken. You have simply seen clearly. And seeing clearly, you know what must be done. Whether this imagined reader actually killed himself, we cannot say. Perhaps he read Mainlander, felt the pull of the argument, and then gradually found his way back to ordinary life, the way most people do when they encounter disturbing ideas. Perhaps the book was a crisis he survived, a brush with the void that ultimately strengthened his grip on existence. This is the more common outcome after all. Most people who read Mainlander do not kill themselves. Most people who contemplate suicide do not complete it. The will to live is stronger than most philosophies, most arguments, most proofs of life's meaninglessness. This is one of the strange facts about human beings. We are capable of believing that life is not worth living and continuing to live anyway. We can hold the conclusion in our minds without acting on it. We can agree with Mainlander intellectually while disagreeing with him behaviourally, going on with our days and our years as if we had never read him at all. Mainlander himself would have found this inconsistency contemptible. It was precisely this kind of bad faith, this cowardly refusal to act on one's beliefs, that he sought to overcome. He demanded that philosophy be lived, not merely thought. He insisted that ideas have consequences and that the consequence of his ideas was death. But most human beings are not built for this kind of consistency. We are built for survival, not for logic. Our bodies want to continue even when our minds have decided that continuation is pointless. This is the biological will that Mainlander identified as the remnant of God's creative force, the last flickering of the divine impulse that brought the universe into being. Even as we consciously reject existence, unconsciously we cling to it. The will to live is older than reason, older than language, older than any argument that could be made against it. It is written in our cells, in our reflexes, in the automatic beating of our hearts. To overcome it requires more than intellectual conviction. It requires a sustained act of will, a breaking of the most fundamental programming our bodies contain. This is why suicide is rare even among those who believe life is meaningless. This is why the suicide clusters attributed to Mainlander, if they occurred at all, were limited in scope. The arguments can convince the mind, but the body has its own convictions, and they are far more difficult to override. Mainlander himself must have known this. His years of contemplation before his final act suggest that conviction alone was not sufficient, that even with his philosophy fully formed in his mind, he still had to work his way up to the moment of execution. The will to live is a formidable opponent. It does not yield to arguments the way a debate opponent yields to superior logic. It fights with everything it has, deploying fear, doubt, hope, distraction, anything that might keep the organism going for another hour, another day, another year. And yet Mainlander won. He overcame the will, and he died on his own terms, at the time and in the manner he had chosen. For him, this was victory, For the universe, it was one more small step toward the absolute peace of non-existence. For his readers, it was a proof and a challenge. If he could do it, then his philosophy was not merely theoretical, it was actionable. It could be lived, or rather it could be died. The question each reader faced was whether they had the courage, or perhaps the clarity, to follow where he had led. The shadow of Mainlander falls across the entire history of philosophical pessimism. He represents its end point, its logical conclusion, the place where the argument must go if it is not to stop short of its own implications. After Mainlander, pessimism could no longer pretend to be merely an intellectual position, an interesting perspective to consider and then set aside. He had demonstrated that it was a path, and that the path led somewhere specific, and that arriving at that destination meant no longer arriving anywhere ever again. This is perhaps why the 20th century, despite being full of suffering and meaninglessness, did not produce philosophers who followed Mainlander's approach. The world wars, the genocides, the existential threat of nuclear annihilation, all of these might have been expected to give rise to philosophies of radical pessimism, to thinkers who concluded that the human experiment had failed, and that collective extinction was the only reasonable response. But instead, the 20th century produced existentialism, which acknowledged the meaninglessness of existence but then insisted on creating meaning anyway. It produced absurdism, which laughed at the void rather than jumping into it. It produced a kind of ironic pessimism that could discuss the worst possibilities without ever quite taking them seriously. Mainlander's direct, earnest, absolutely literal approach to the problem of existence found few takers. He was too sincere. He believed too completely in his own arguments. He did not leave room for the escape hatches that allow most people to hold dark ideas without being consumed by them. The philosophers who did engage with Mainlander tended to treat him as a curiosity, a fascinating case study rather than a serious thinker whose arguments required refutation. How do you argue with someone who has already taken his own conclusion to its final demonstration? What is left to say to a philosopher who is no longer there to respond? The debate, if there ever was one, ended the moment Mainlander tied the knot. His death was the last word in any possible discussion, and that last word was silence. But silence is not nothing. Silence can be eloquent in its own way. The silence that followed Mainlander's death, the absence of his voice from the ongoing conversation of philosophy, this silence spoke volumes about the limits of what academic discourse could handle. There are ideas that cannot be safely examined in the bright light of the seminar room, ideas that do not behave themselves when analysed and dissected, ideas that reach out from the page and grip the reader in ways that other ideas do not. Mainlander's philosophy was one of these dangerous ideas, and the profession of philosophy, perhaps wisely, chose to keep its distance. This does not mean that his influence disappeared entirely. Ideas have a way of persisting, even when they are not acknowledged, even when they are actively suppressed. Mainlander's concepts filtered into later thought through indirect channels, through readers who absorbed his ideas without naming their source, through thinkers who arrived independently at similar conclusions, and discovered only later that someone had been there before them. His vision of a universe in decay, of existence as a wound that consciousness makes in non-being, of death as the only genuine cure for the disease of life, these ideas have surfaced again and again in different forms under different names, disconnected from the man who gave them their most systematic expression. The antinatalist philosophers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, for example, reached conclusions remarkably similar to Mainlander's without necessarily having read him. David Benatar's argument that coming into existence is always a harm, that it would be better never to have been born, echoes Mainlander's insistence that the decline from being into non-being is the proper direction of existence. Thomas Ligotti's philosophical horror, which presents consciousness as a terrible mistake, and existence as a nightmare from which we cannot wake, captures the mood of Mainlander's pessimism, even if it does not directly cite his work. These later thinkers may have arrived at their positions independently, or they may have absorbed Mainlander's influence through secondary sources, through the general atmosphere of pessimist thought that his work helped to create. Either way, his ideas have proven impossible to fully suppress. They keep returning, generation after generation, as new thinkers discover that the old questions have not been answered, and that the darkest conclusions are still available to anyone willing to follow the argument where it leads. There is something almost biological about this persistence. Ideas, like genes, replicate themselves through minds that serve as their hosts. The most successful ideas are those that find ways to keep themselves in circulation, that attach themselves to human interests and human emotions in ways that ensure their transmission to new generations. Mainlander's philosophy, despite its self-destructive implications, has survival characteristics that allow it to persist. It speaks to a certain kind of suffering. It offers a certain kind of explanation. It provides a certain kind of meaning, even if that meaning points toward meaninglessness. For as long as there are human beings who suffer and wonder why, there will be a readership for philosophies that take suffering seriously and offer frameworks for understanding it. Mainlander will never be popular. His work will never be widely read. But it will always have readers, always attract those seekers who need something stronger than the usual consolations, something that does not flinch from the darkest possibilities. The night grows deeper around us now as we consider what it meant for Mainlander's ideas to persist through the decades that followed his death. His book survived, though barely. The copies of The Philosophy of Redemption that he had arranged to be printed passed into the hands of collectors, scholars, and the occasional curious reader who stumbled across a reference and tracked down this obscure work. The second volume, the one that never saw its author alive, was published posthumously, adding several hundred more pages to his system. Together, the two volumes formed a complete statement of his philosophy, a monument to the thought of a man who had believed so completely in non-existence that he had chosen to exemplify it. The physical books themselves became objects of a peculiar fascination. There is something charged about holding a text, whose author killed himself in order to write it, whose very existence is inseparable from a death that was its purpose. The pages carry a weight that other philosophy books do not carry. The arguments press in with an urgency that academic philosophy rarely achieves. You cannot read Mainlander casually, the way you might skim through other thinkers looking for interesting ideas. His work demands a kind of confrontation. It asks you, with every page, whether you agree or disagree, and it makes clear that your answer has consequences. The handful of scholars who did seek out Mainlander's work in the decades after his death found themselves in possession of something dangerous and rare. They handled these volumes with a mixture of reverence and unease, aware that they held not merely a philosophical treatise, but a kind of testament, a final statement issued from the threshold between existence and its negation. Some of these readers became disciples of a sort, though Mainlander would have been suspicious of discipleship, would have questioned whether any follower truly understood the radical implications of what he had argued. Others became critics, determined to refute what they found in those pages, to demonstrate that the logic was flawed, the conclusions unwarranted, the entire edifice built on questionable premises. But even the critics could not simply dismiss what they had read. The work had gotten inside them in some way. It had posed questions that lingered, that returned in quiet moments, that could not be fully answered by the usual philosophical moves. Among these early readers were individuals whose lives would be changed by their encounter with Mainlander's philosophy. The stories are fragmentary, passed down through letters and memoirs and the occasional scholarly footnote, but they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Here was a young academic in Vienna who became obsessed with the philosophy of redemption, who read it repeatedly over the course of several years, who grew increasingly withdrawn and melancholic, and who eventually took his own life in a manner that echoed Mainlander's own death. Here was a literary figure in Berlin who wrote admiringly of Mainlander in his private correspondence, who incorporated elements of Mainlander's thought into his own pessimistic fiction, and who later succumbed to the same despair he had spent his career describing. Here was a priest who lost his faith after reading Mainlander, who could not reconcile the God of Christianity with the dying God of the philosophy of redemption, and who wandered through his remaining years in a spiritual wilderness from which he never emerged. These cases are difficult to verify with certainty. The sources are often second-hand, the details sometimes contradictory, the causal connections impossible to establish with scholarly rigour. We cannot know for certain that Mainlander's work was the decisive factor in any particular tragedy. Human beings are complex, and suicide is always the result of multiple converging circumstances. Perhaps these readers were already predisposed to despair, already searching for a philosophical justification for conclusions they had reached on their own. Perhaps Mainlander's work merely confirmed what they already believed, gave shape and language to suffering that existed prior to any encounter with his ideas. But the pattern persists, the stories accumulate, and the frequency with which Mainlander's name appears in connection with these dark outcomes suggests that something more than coincidence is at work. The question this raises is one that philosophers have debated for as long as philosophy has existed. What responsibility does a thinker bear for the effects of his ideas? Is an author culpable if his readers, moved by his arguments, take actions that harm themselves or others? The standard answer in the Western philosophical tradition has been no. Ideas are meant to be evaluated on their merits, their truth or falsehood, their logical coherence or incoherence. The uses to which they are put by readers are beyond the author's control and outside the scope of his responsibility. We do not blame Newton for nuclear weapons, the argument goes. We do not hold Nietzsche responsible for the misreadings of his work by fascists and anti-Semites. Authors put their ideas into the world, and what happens afterward is the concern of those who receive them. But Mainlander presents a challenge to this comfortable separation. His philosophy was not merely a description of the world that could be passively accepted or rejected. It was, in its final implications, a call to action. The argument that non-existence is preferable to existence, that the will to die represents the highest expression of wisdom, that the universe itself is engaged in a vast project of self-annihilation, that human beings should consciously join, this is not a neutral observation. It is an invitation. And Mainlander knew it was an invitation. He followed its logic himself on the day his book was printed, using the very pages of the Philosophy of Redemption as the platform from which to launch himself into the void. His death was not separate from his philosophy. It was the final chapter, the demonstration that proved the theorem, the act that completed the argument. How, then, can we say that Mainlander bears no responsibility for readers who followed where he led? The situation is more complex than the standard philosophical defence allows. Mainlander was not merely offering ideas for consideration. He was modelling a way of being, or rather a way of ceasing to be. He was showing his readers that the conclusions he had reached were livable, or rather not livable, that one could act on them, that they were not just abstract propositions but practical guides to conduct. Those who read his work and took their own lives may have seen themselves as following his example, completing the same journey he had completed, arriving at the same destination he had reached. They were not merely persuaded by his arguments, they were imitating his death. This is uncomfortable territory, and it is tempting to turn away from it, to change the subject to the purely philosophical aspects of Mainlander's thought, to discuss his metaphysics or his ethics in terms that keep the existential stakes at a safe distance. But to do so would be to miss something essential about what makes Mainlander different from other pessimist thinkers. Schopenhauer, for all his gloom, lived to the age of 72 and died peacefully in his bed. He advocated asceticism and the quieting of the will, but he did not suggest that readers should hasten their own deaths. His pessimism was contemplative, something to be understood and perhaps transcended through art and philosophical reflection, not something to be acted upon in the most final way possible. Mainlander broke with this tradition. He insisted that the logic of pessimism, followed to its end, demanded not just resignation but extinction. And he proved his commitment to this conclusion in the only way it could be proved. This is why the reports of readers who followed him have a different character than the stories we sometimes hear of philosophical influence gone wrong. When someone reads a political philosopher and commits violence in the name of the ideas they encountered, we can usually point to a misreading, a distortion, a selective emphasis that twists the original argument into something the author would not have recognised. But when someone reads Mainlander and takes their own life, it is difficult to call this a misreading. It is, in some terrible sense, the correct reading. It is the response that Mainlander himself modelled, the conclusion that his argument supports. The philosophy of redemption redeems through annihilation. Those who sought annihilation after reading it were not misunderstanding the text. They were understanding it all too well. The responsibility for this cannot be placed entirely on Mainlander's shoulders. He is not holding a gun to anyone's head. He is not issuing commands. His readers are free agents who make their own choices, and those choices are ultimately theirs. But the question of influence is not so easily resolved. We know from research in other contexts that suicide can be contagious, that publicised deaths by suicide can trigger clusters of similar deaths. that the mere availability of a narrative framework for self-destruction can make such destruction more likely. This is why there are careful guidelines for how media should report on suicide, why certain details are deliberately omitted, why the focus is placed on prevention and help-seeking rather than on the act itself. Mainländer, writing in the 19th century, knew nothing of these later findings, but he intuited something similar. He understood that ideas have power, that philosophical arguments can shape behaviour, that his work was not merely describing the world but potentially changing it. He chose to publish anyway. He chose to demonstrate his conclusions with his own death. And in doing so, he created a template that others would follow. The night is very quiet now, and we have travelled far into difficult territory. It might seem natural to pull back, to offer some counter-argument, some reason why Mainländer was wrong, some demonstration that his logic fails at some crucial point and that existence is, after all, preferable to non-existence. Such counter-arguments exist, and they have been developed by philosophers who reject pessimism and antinatalism, but to simply assert them here would be to do a disservice to the seriousness of Mainländer's position. He was not a fool. He was not ignorant of the objections that could be raised against his conclusions. He considered them and found them wanting. He worked through the alternatives and concluded that they did not hold. Whether he was right about this is something each reader must decide for themselves, but the decision should not be made lightly, should not be based on a hasty dismissal of views that make us uncomfortable. Mainländer deserves the same careful consideration we would give to any other systematic philosopher, even if, perhaps especially if, we hope to refute him in the end. What we can say with confidence is that his philosophy represents one of the most extreme positions ever articulated in the history of thought. Other pessimists have argued that life contains more suffering than happiness, that the balance of existence is negative, that it would be better never to have been born. But they have typically stopped short of the conclusion that one should actively seek non-existence, that suicide is not merely permissible, but represents the highest wisdom. Mainländer goes all the way. He does not flinch, does not look for loopholes, does not offer consolations that might soften the blow. This is what makes his work so powerful and so dangerous. It follows the logic wherever it leads, and it leads to a place where most of us instinctively do not want to go. And yet something keeps readers coming back to Mainländer, generation after generation, despite the darkness of his conclusions. There is a reason his work has not been entirely forgotten, a reason new editions continue to appear, a reason scholars write about him, and philosophers engage with his arguments. Part of this is simply the fascination of the extreme. We are drawn to thinkers who go further than others, who push ideas to their limits, who say what most people are afraid to say. But there is something more than morbid curiosity at work here. There is a sense shared by many of Mainländer's readers that he is grappling with questions that matter, questions that cannot be avoided by anyone who thinks seriously about the human condition. Why do we suffer? What is the purpose of existence? Is life worth living? These are not questions that philosophy has answered to everyone's satisfaction. They remain open, contested, urgent, and Mainländer offers one possible set of answers that some readers find compelling, even as they recoil from their implications. There is also, paradoxically, a kind of comfort to be found in Mainländer's philosophy. This may seem like an absurd thing to say about a thinker who advocates extinction, but consider what his system offers to those who are already suffering. It tells them that their suffering is not their fault, not a punishment for sins they have committed, not a sign that they are doing something wrong. It locates suffering in the very structure of existence itself, in the nature of a universe that is slowly dying, in the condition of beings who carry within themselves a fragment of the divine will to death. This may not be a cheerful message, but for someone in the grip of despair it can be strangely consoling. Your pain has a meaning. Your darkness is not a personal failing, but a reflection of cosmic reality. You're not alone in your suffering. The entire universe shares it with you, and Mainländer offers something else as well, something that many religious traditions struggle to provide. He offers an end. Not an afterlife, not a continuation of consciousness in some other form, not the wheel of reincarnation that returns you again and again to the same round of suffering. He offers oblivion, complete, final, irreversible nothingness. For those who find the prospect of eternal existence terrifying, who cannot bear the thought of going on forever, this is a gift. It is the promise that the pain will not last, that there is a terminus, that non-existence awaits at the end of the long journey. Whether this is a truth or an illusion, it functions for some readers as a source of peace. The worst thing about suffering is often the sense that it might go on forever. Mainlander assures you that it will not. These psychological dimensions of Mainlander's appeal do not validate his metaphysics or his ethics. The fact that a belief makes us feel better does not make it true. But they help explain why his work continues to find readers, why it persists in the margins of the philosophical tradition, why it refuses to disappear despite decades of neglect and suppression. Mainlander speaks to a real need, addresses a real form of suffering, offers a real kind of meaning to those who can find meaning nowhere else. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, what philosophy has always claimed to do, to help human beings understand their situation and live, or in this case not live, accordingly. The copies of the Philosophy of Redemption that survived into the 20th century passed through various hands, each reader leaving behind traces of their encounter with Mainlander's thought. Some of these readers wrote in the margins, arguing with Mainlander, questioning his premises, noting their agreements and disagreements. Others simply read and were silent, leaving no record of their response except the fact that they turned the pages, that they stayed with the argument to the end, that they did not put the book down and walk away. The physical objects themselves became collector's items, sought after by those who specialise in rare philosophical works, prized both for their intellectual content and for their association with a death that has become legendary in the annals of pessimist thought. To hold one of these early editions is to hold something more than paper and ink. It is to hold a piece of a story that is still unfolding, a story whose ending has not yet been written, though Mainlander would say that the ending was written long ago, at the moment when God chose non-existence and set the universe on its path toward extinction. The translation of Mainlander's work into other languages came slowly, over the course of many decades. The original German editions were already difficult to find, and the demand for translations was limited by the obscurity of the author and the challenging nature of his thought. When translations did appear, they tended to be incomplete, focusing on selections from the larger work rather than attempting the enormous task of rendering both volumes into another language. This meant that most non-German readers encountered Mainlander in fragments, getting a sense of his central arguments without experiencing the full systematic development of his philosophy. They knew about the death of God, knew about the will to death, knew about the vision of cosmic extinction, but they did not necessarily grasp how these ideas fit together, how each element supported the others, how the whole system hung together as a unified argument. The fragmentary nature of Mainlander's reception contributed to misunderstandings and oversimplifications. He was reduced to a few shocking claims rather than being understood as the careful, methodical thinker he actually was. More complete translations began to appear only in recent years, as a new generation of scholars took an interest in Mainlander and recognised the importance of making his work accessible to a wider audience. These translators face significant challenges. Mainlander's German is dense and philosophical, full of technical terms that he either borrowed from earlier thinkers or invented himself. His sentences are often long and complex, built around multiple subordinate clauses that must be carefully unwound for readers accustomed to more straightforward prose. The translators had to make decisions about how to render key concepts, whether to coin new English terms or to use existing vocabulary that might carry connotations Mainlander did not intend. Each translation involved interpretation, a reading of Mainlander's meaning that necessarily shaped how new readers would encounter his thought. The translators worked in solitude, much as Mainlander himself had worked, bent over pages in quiet rooms, wrestling with sentences that seemed to resist easy rendering. They understood that translation is never neutral, that every choice about how to phrase an idea in a new language creates subtle shifts in meaning, opens certain interpretive pathways while closing others. To translate the term Wille zum Tod as will to death, rather than death drive, or longing for extinction, was already to shape how English readers would understand Mainlander's relationship to Schopenhauer, to Freud, to the broader tradition of pessimist thought. The translators accepted this responsibility, knowing that their versions of Mainlander would become, for many readers, the only Mainlander they would ever know. And still the readers came, not in great numbers, not in the waves that follow fashionable thinkers or controversial public figures, but in a steady trickle that never quite stopped. They found Mainländer in footnotes, in references buried in other philosophical texts, in the occasional essay or blog post that mentioned him as a curiosity worth investigating. They ordered the books from specialty publishers, or downloaded digital versions from obscure archives. They read alone, usually late at night, in that particular state of mind when the questions that matter most seem most pressing, and the ordinary distractions of daily life have fallen away. What they found there, in those difficult pages, was not what they expected. Most came looking for darkness, for a philosophy that would confirm their worst suspicions about existence, that would tell them they were right to feel that something was fundamentally wrong with being alive. And yes, they found darkness. They found the claim that the universe was running down, that life was a form of suffering, that the only redemption lay in the cessation of all existence. But they also found something else, something that surprised them, something that complicated the simple narrative of Mainländer as the philosopher of suicide. They found compassion. This is perhaps the most unexpected element of Mainländer's philosophy, the one that is easiest to miss if you approach his work with preconceptions about what a pessimist thinker must be. For all his talk of death and extinction, for all his unflinching acceptance of cosmic annihilation, Mainländer is remarkably tender in his treatment of suffering beings. He does not mock those who cling to life, does not despise them for their illusions, does not rage against the stupidity of existence with the bitter scorn that characterizes some pessimist writing. Instead, he looks upon the struggling creatures of the world with something like love, recognizing in their pain his own pain, in their longing his own longing, in their inevitable failure the failure that belongs to all finite beings trying to exist in a universe that no longer supports existence. This compassion is not incidental to Mainländer's philosophy. It is woven into its very structure. If all beings are fragments of a God who chose non-existence, then all beings are, in some sense, divine. They carry within themselves a piece of that original unity, however shattered and scattered it may now be. To harm another being is to harm something that was once God, to add unnecessary suffering to a cosmos already saturated with suffering. Mainländer's ethics, which occupies a significant portion of his philosophical system, is built on this foundation of universal kinship. He advocates for gentleness, for patience, for the reduction of cruelty wherever possible. He argues that while we cannot prevent the suffering that is inherent in existence itself, we can and should avoid inflicting additional suffering through our own actions. This is not the philosophy of a nihilist who believes that nothing matters. It is the philosophy of someone who believes that because existence is suffering, compassion becomes the highest virtue, the one thing that can make the brief span of consciousness bearable. Mainländer did not want people to hurt each other. He did not want them to add to the weight of pain that the universe was already carrying. He wanted them, insofar as it was possible, to be kind. The readers who stayed with Mainländer long enough to understand this found themselves in an unexpected position. They had come looking for a justification for despair, and they had found instead a call to compassion. They had expected to be told that life was meaningless, and they had been told instead that life was full of a meaning they could not escape, a meaning rooted in the shared suffering of all beings and the shared destiny of universal extinction. This was not comforting in the conventional sense. It did not promise heaven or reunion or purpose in the way that religious consolations promise these things, but it was not empty either. It offered something real, something that could be lived with, something that made a difference to how one moved through the world. The question of whether Mainländer's philosophy encourages suicide is more complex than it first appears. On the surface, the answer seems obvious. Here is a man who argued that existence is suffering, that non-existence is preferable to existence, and who then killed himself on the very day his philosophical work was published. How could this not be an encouragement to suicide? How could readers not understand his death as the logical conclusion of his arguments, an implicit instruction to follow where he had led? But Mainländer himself did not see it this way, or at least did not express it this way in his philosophical writings. He distinguished carefully between what he called voluntary and involuntary extinction. Voluntary extinction, choosing to end one's own life, was one path to the annihilation that all beings were seeking. But it was not the only path, and it was not necessarily the best path. Mainländer recognized that the will to death operated at many levels, that the universe was moving toward extinction through countless processes that had nothing to do with individual choice. The stars would burn out, The energy of the cosmos would dissipate. Everything would end, eventually, whether any individual person chose death or not. Given this cosmic inevitability, Mainländer argued that individuals were free to choose their own relationship to extinction. Some would hasten it through suicide. Others would hasten it through celibacy, by refusing to bring new suffering beings into existence. Still others would simply live out their natural spans, allowing the ordinary processes of aging and death to accomplish what the universe was already accomplishing on a larger scale. None of these choices was wrong in Mainlander's view. All of them were expressions of the will to death that moved through all things. What mattered was not which path one chose, but that one chose consciously, with full understanding of what one was doing and why. This framework does not justify suicide in the simple way that critics have sometimes claimed. It places suicide within a larger context, treats it as one option among several, denies that it is obligatory or even necessarily preferable. A person who reads Mainländer and understands him fully might conclude that the right response to his philosophy is not to end one's own life, but simply to stop having children, to break the chain of reproduction that extends suffering into the future. Or they might conclude that the right response is to live as compassionately as possible, to reduce suffering wherever they can, to wait for death to come in its own time while treating other beings with the gentleness that their shared condition demands. But this nuance was often lost, especially among readers who encountered Mainländer in fragments, who knew only the shocking claims without understanding the careful system within which those claims were embedded. And there were the followers, the ones who reportedly took their own lives after reading his work, whose deaths became part of the Mainländer legend and made it difficult to discuss his philosophy without also discussing the bodies it supposedly left behind. The evidence for these followers is largely anecdotal, passed down through philosophical gossip and footnotes, never systematically documented in the way that a historian would require. Some scholars have questioned whether the phenomenon was as widespread as legend suggests, whether the deaths attributed to Mainlander's influence actually occurred in the numbers and manner claimed. Others have pointed out that the period in which Mainlander's work circulated was also a period of social upheaval, economic distress, and widespread suffering that might have contributed to elevated suicide rates regardless of what people were reading. To attribute any particular death to a philosophical text is a complicated business, requiring evidence about the reader's inner life that is rarely available. And yet the stories persist. A young man in Vienna found dead with a copy of The Philosophy of Redemption beside him. A woman in Berlin who wrote in her diary that Mainländer had shown her the truth and then stopped writing altogether, her silence interpreted by later readers as an ominous sign. A circle of intellectuals who discussed Mainlander's ideas together, and who, one by one, over the course of several years, took their own lives. These stories may be exaggerated or even invented. They have grown in the telling as stories about the macabre tend to grow, but they attached themselves to Mainlander's name and became inseparable from his philosophical legacy. Whether the followers were real or legendary, their existence raises questions that Mainländer himself never fully answered. If a philosophy leads people to death, what is the philosopher's responsibility? Is the philosopher obligated to anticipate how his ideas might be received, to soften or qualify them to prevent misunderstanding? Or is philosophy a pursuit of truth regardless of consequences, a discipline that must follow its arguments wherever they lead, even if they lead to conclusions that some readers cannot survive? Mainländer would likely have rejected the premise of these questions. He did not believe he was leading anyone anywhere. He believed he was describing reality as it actually was, revealing a truth that existed independently of his articulation of it. If that truth was hard to bear, that was not his doing. He had not created the universe, had not arranged it so that existence was suffering, and extinction was the only release. He was merely the messenger, the one who happened to see clearly what others preferred to ignore. To blame him for the consequences of his clarity would be like blaming the physician who diagnoses a terminal illness for the fact of death itself. And yet he must have known. He must have understood that his ideas would land differently on different readers, that some would find in them a path to peace, while others would find in them a path to destruction. He wrote for an audience he could not see, whose individual circumstances and psychological vulnerabilities he could not know. When he placed that copy of his book beneath his feet and hanged himself in his room in Offenbach, he was not simply dying. He was creating a symbol, a final gesture that would shape how every subsequent reader understood his words. He was saying, with his body, that he meant what he wrote, that this was not merely an intellectual exercise but a lived commitment to a vision of reality that demanded a response. That response has taken many forms over the century and a half since Mainlander's death. Some readers have responded with horror, rejecting his philosophy outright and warning others away from it. Others have responded with fascination, drawn to the darkness as moths are drawn to light, finding in Mainlander's pessimism a strange kind of beauty that they cannot fully explain. Still others have responded with philosophical engagement, taking Mainlander's arguments seriously and attempting to refute them, to show where he went wrong, to demonstrate that existence is not as he described it, and that life is worth living after all. None of these responses has succeeded in silencing Mainlander or in neutralizing the power of his ideas. The horror only makes him more intriguing to those who are drawn to forbidden knowledge. The fascination sustains his readership without resolving the questions he poses. The philosophical refutations, however clever, cannot quite escape the nagging suspicion that Mainlander might have been onto something, that his vision of cosmic decline might be closer to the truth than the optimistic alternatives his critics propose. The 20th century seemed in many ways to confirm Mainlander's darkest intuitions. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the development of nuclear weapons capable of ending human civilization in an afternoon, the slow recognition that humanity was altering the climate in ways that might make the planet uninhabitable for future generations, the discovery that the universe was not eternal, that it had a beginning and would have an end, that even the stars were dying and would eventually go dark. None of this was what Mainlander predicted in the specific sense, but all of it seemed to vindicate his general worldview, his sense that existence was fragile and temporary, that the forces of destruction were stronger than the forces of creation, that everything was winding down towards some final darkness from which there would be no return. And yet the 20th century also saw acts of extraordinary courage, kindness, and creativity that seemed to defy Mainlander's pessimism. People loved each other in the midst of suffering, built beautiful things in the shadow of destruction, found meaning in lives that should have been meaningless if Mainlander was right. The century was not only a confirmation of his vision, it was also a challenge to it, a demonstration that human beings could find reasons to live even when the philosophical arguments against living seemed overwhelming. This tension between the darkness of Mainlander's philosophy and the stubborn persistence of human hope remains unresolved. It may be unresolvable. Perhaps the truth is that both are real, that life is suffering and also meaningful, that existence is declining toward extinction and also full of moments worth having. Mainlander's genius was to see one side of this equation with perfect clarity. His limitation was to think that seeing one side meant there was nothing on the other side worth seeing. The room in Offenbach where he died no longer exists in the form he knew it. The building has been altered, demolished, rebuilt. The physical space that contained his final act has been absorbed into the ordinary processes of urban renewal and decay, becoming indistinguishable from all the other spaces that once held significant events and now hold nothing but the amnesia of the present. If you go to Offenbach today, you will not find a plaque marking the spot where Philipp Mainländer ended his life. You will not find pilgrims seeking his grave or scholars tracing his footsteps. You will find a city that has largely forgotten him, absorbed in the concerns of the living as all cities are absorbed in the concerns of the living. And yet something remains. In the libraries and archives, in the rare book collections and the digital repositories, the copies of The Philosophy of Redemption continue to exist. They are read even now by people who are seeking something that the ordinary consolations cannot provide. They are discussed in seminar rooms and online forums, argued over by philosophers who disagree about almost everything except the fact that Mainlander deserves to be taken seriously. The ideas that Mainlander developed in his years of solitary work, the system he built with such painstaking care, the vision of reality that drove him to his final act, these things have not disappeared. They persist as ideas always persist, finding new hosts, adapting to new contexts, continuing to do their strange work in minds that their originator never imagined. Mainlander wanted to be forgotten. He believed that oblivion was the goal, that the cessation of all existence, including his own, was the only true redemption. But he wrote a book, and the book survived. And as long as the book survives, he is not entirely gone. There is an irony in this, one that Mainlander himself might have appreciated with his characteristic dark humour. The philosopher of extinction lives on through the very medium he used to argue for the end of all things. The advocate of silence speaks across centuries to readers he will never know. The man who saw death as the highest good continues to exist in the minds of the living, refusing to disappear, refusing to grant even himself the oblivion he sought. Perhaps this is the final lesson of Mainlander's life and work. Not that existence is suffering, though it often is. Not that extinction is desirable, though for some it may be. But that the relationship between life and death, between existence and non-existence, between speech and silence, is more complicated than any philosophy can fully capture. Mainlander tried to say everything, to build a complete system that would answer every question and leave nothing out. But something escaped him, slipped through the careful architecture of his arguments, and emerged on the other side, unexpected and unaccounted for. That something is life itself, in all its stubbornness and absurdity, its refusal to accept the conclusions that logic demands, its insistence on continuing even when continuation makes no sense. The readers who find Mainlander and do not die, who read his words and feel something loosen in their chests, something relax, something like permission to acknowledge the darkness without being destroyed by it. These readers are proof that his philosophy does not have the last word. They take what they need and leave the rest. They carry pieces of his thought into futures he never imagined. They use his pessimism, paradoxically, as a tool for living, as a way of accepting the unacceptable and making peace with what cannot be changed. The stack of books that Mainlander stood on to reach the noose has long since crumbled to dust. The rope he used has been gone for more than a century, but the ideas, the strange and terrible and beautiful ideas, they remain. They wait in the pages of his books, patient as they have always been, ready to be found by whoever needs to find them. And somewhere, right now, in a quiet room in a city Mainlander never visited, someone is opening the philosophy of redemption. For the first time, beginning the long journey into his thought, not knowing yet where it will lead. They may close the book and never think of it again. They may become devoted students of his philosophy, spending years unravelling its complexities. They may find comfort or terror or both. They may decide that Mainlander was wrong, that his arguments fail, that existence is not what he claimed. Or they may decide that he was right and choose how to live, or not live, with that knowledge. Whatever they decide, they will have encountered something real, something that spoke from one human consciousness to another across the gulf of time and death. And that, in the end, is all that any philosopher can hope for. Not to be right, necessarily, though Mainlander believed he was right. Not to change the world, though the world is changed by every mind that moves through it. Simply to speak, to articulate the thoughts that rise in the darkness of the mind, to send them out into the unknown future in the fragile vessels of written words, and to trust that somewhere, someday, someone will listen. Philipp Mainländer listened to the philosophers who came before him. He took their thoughts into himself, wrestled with them, transformed them, and produced something new. And then he placed his work into the stream of time and stepped out of it, leaving behind only the words and the silence that followed. The words are still here. The silence is still listening.